Hello everyone and welcome to episode 3 of Nuki Zoo, Stand by Nuki Zoo's All About. Today I'm going to be talking to you about reptiles. I'm going to be giving you a brief history of their origin, their key characteristics, some of the threats that they face in the wild, and how you can help UK's reptiles. A little later today I'll be doing the same but with amphibians, so be sure to check that out as well. History and evolution. Reptiles first originated around 320 to 310 million years ago in the late Carboniferous period. They were mostly found around swamps and boggy areas. It's thought that one of the first reptile species to be found evolved from the amphibians and was called Cassania. The images on the left here show one of the first fossils found of this species, and the image on the right shows a reconstruction by an artist of what the species would have actually looked like. One of the main reasons why scientists consider this to be one of the earliest reptile species is because its fossil was found with claws on its digits, as you can see here on the artist's reconstruction. And when the creatures have these type of claws, it's also often assumed that their skin would also have scales, which is made of keratin, which the claws were also made out of. And scales were one of the unique characteristics that are only really found on reptiles, as amphibians would not have scales. Their skin would be more smooth, more soft, because they use gas exchange. They use their skin as a method of gas exchange. Another strong piece of evidence to suggest that this was one of the earliest reptile species that evolved from amphibians is that most of its fossils were found in rocky areas, and for their fossils to be found here, it means that they were living here and they were breeding in those rocky areas, which amphibians wouldn't have been able to do because their eggs needed to have a water source in order to be able to hatch. So this species was most likely living and breeding in rocky areas without water sources, which would have made it mostly a terrestrial creature without the need of water, which would have definitively made it a reptile instead of an amphibian. The reptile group then later decides to split down again into 3 main groups, and these 3 main groups are based on how many holes are found in the skull. As you can see here, one of the first groups, A, to split was the anapsid group, and then B, which is the synapsid group, and then C, which is the diapsid group. Each of them have different levels of holes. Most of the species that you'll be familiar with today, almost all modern species, and a lot of the famous species such as the dinosaurs, all belong to this group here of the diapsid group, and a lot of the other species from these 2 groups ended up dying out or becoming less common. A few million years down the line later, during the Permian period, the diapsid group, this group here, then split again into 2 main groups. One of the main groups is called the stem archosaurs, which are the ancestors of modern day crocodiles, the ancestors of dinosaurs, and the ancestors of modern day birds as well. And then the second group that they split into was the lepidosaurs, which are the ancestors of today's snakes and lizards. Dinosaurs were a big part of reptiles' history. It's probably what made reptiles pretty famous. They're one of the largest groups of reptiles that ever existed. Hundreds of species in the fossil record and not all of them found yet. And dinosaurs were made up of mainly 2 groups. The first group, as seen here, have a lizard-hipped bone joint, and this group belonged to most of your famous dinosaurs such as your Tyrannosaurus rex, your Allosaurus, your Triceratops. Most of the larger theropods and herbivores all belong to this type of group. Unfortunately, this group ended up being the main group that suffered from the extinction. And then you have the second group here, which is a group which is nicknamed the bird-hipped group. The distinction here is being this elongated bone here. The majority of these species were slightly smaller than the lizard-hip group, and these species here would then go on to later split into what would be modern-day birds, whereas most of these species did die out in the extinction. Overall, though, dinosaurs were a pretty impressive group. They roamed the earth for around 200 million years compared to humans, which we've only just been on here for 6 million years. And they were the largest land creatures to ever exist. Down here in the bottom left, we have the Argentinosaurus, which is today the largest land creature that we've ever found. It's around 40 meters in length and weighs up to about 88 tons. It's still not quite as large as the blue whale in terms of weight, but in terms of length it does overtake it. Around 66 million years ago, however, the extinction event called the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction caused 75% of all life on Earth to be wiped out. And it was a big hit for the reptile group because almost all the large dinosaurs and what made up most of the reptile group were wiped out during this period, and the only ones that really survived were the crocodilian group and the smaller reptiles which belong to the lepidosaurs, which were the ancestors of your smaller snakes and lizards today. So what makes a reptile? There are a few key characteristics that make up a reptile. Some of them they do share with other groups such as amphibians and birds, as that's what they are closest related to. So the first is egg laying. Reptiles are what's classed as ovoviviparous, in which the females lay eggs, and reptiles reproduce asexually. They have a sex organ called the cloaca. Male turtles and crocodiles do have a penis, which is similar to mammals, and snakes and lizards have a pair of hemipenes. Females then produce eggs with a shell. This shell protects the embryo and still allows gas exchange. Reptile eggs contain a substance called chorion, in which helps aid this gas exchange, and albumin, which provides a source of protein and water. Some reptiles, like crocodiles, will also incubate their eggs, along with sea turtles, which will bury them in the sand first to help them hatch more efficiently. Next is one of the most interesting main characteristics that reptiles have. They do share it with amphibians as well, is that they are what's classed as cold-blooded, or the scientific term being ectothermic. It basically means that they have no physical internal way of being able to regulate their own body temperature. So for humans, for example, we regulate our body temperature internally. We keep it around 37 to 38 degrees. The main point of having an optimal body temperature is that it's good for, and at the most optimal temperature for, our enzymes to be able to work most efficiently. And reptiles do have a slight adaptation in which a lot of their enzymes are a bit more flexible with the temperatures. They can go a bit higher and a bit lower than humans without any physical symptoms. It's also why the large majority of reptiles are found more towards the equator in tropical areas and desert areas. However, reptiles are still really widespread around the world. The only places they're not really found are the Arctic Circle and in the Antarctic, but the further away you do get from the equator, the less diverse and the amount of biodiversity of reptiles does decrease. As kind of seen here in the UK, kind of moderate weather, but not a huge amount of diversity of reptiles. As a result of being cold-blooded, reptiles will also display behaviors such as basking, which you can see this terrapin's doing here on the rock. It's a common behavior in reptiles, especially earlier on the day. It's where they try and get the kind of early morning sunshine if it's available, heat up their blood, build up their energy levels, get the metabolism going a bit, and when it is nighttime and the temperatures are lower, reptiles typically are less active. Some reptile species will also hibernate in the winter period, and instead of trying to withdraw it. Temperature and humidity is also a large part in housing and keeping reptiles, whether that's at home or whether it's at wildlife sanctuaries or zoos and places like that. The right temperature and right humidity needs to always be kept, so their enzymes are able to work properly, they have their optimal body temperature, and having the right heating conditions can also help avoid things such as digestive problems, and can overall just benefit the animals. So it's very important that if anybody's ever thinking about getting a pet reptile, to make sure you do your research on the right temperatures and the right equipment, on how to effectively keep a reptile and maintain its welfare up to high standards, because it's important that their ectothermic needs are met. Another main characteristic of reptiles seen here is that they do have a very similar respiration system to mammals. They breathe through lungs. Their gas exchange occurs over the alveoli, and however, some species of turtles are able to exchange gas through their skin, which is very similar to what amphibians do. One of the main characteristics that reptiles exclusively have is the presence of scales or scutes. And scales are made up of keratin, which is formed in the upper level of the skin or the upper epidermis. Reptile scales are tubular, and in snakes and lizards they are plate-like and can be highly varied depending on the size of the reptile and where it lives. Scales also determine colour, they protect the body, they maintain moisture and aid movement, especially in the snake group. Scutes are slightly different as they are non-overlapping scales. They're found slightly deeper within the skin, in the lower dermis, and they're slightly more armour-like and are mostly found in the crocodilian species as seen here, and the turtle species. So as touched on before, one of the most interesting parts of reptiles is that they are ectotherms, and it's a big part of what reptiles kind of are. It plays a big part in their behavior and what they look like. And the term cold-blooded is often misunderstood because even though it's kind of sounds right, but it is technically incorrect, as reptiles' blood is never really cold, else that reptile probably would end up being dead or dying if it did have cold blood. Reptiles' blood is normally however hot the actual temperature is, and because they're usually found in hot temperatures, reptile blood usually is around the same temperature as a mammal blood, or maybe a bit higher, or maybe just slightly lower. The main advantage of being an ectotherm or cold-blooded is that reptiles need much less energy than mammals, and this can allow them to go much longer periods of time without eating the mammals can. For example, the Nile crocodile, a large species of crocodile found in Africa's Nile River, can actually go up to around 3 years without needing any food at all. Along with snakes are similar as well. A very common snake in the UK in the pet trade, the ball python, typically known to be a little bit of a fussy eater and can go up to 6 to 9 months without eating food. It doesn't necessarily do them any good to not eat, but it doesn't typically harm them that much in the long term. They will end up still losing weight, they will look thinner, but it's not extremely unhealthy for them to go long periods, unlike mammalian carnivores where they're going to be suffering, lions, wolves, bears, they're going to be suffering from just a few days without eating, or a few weeks without eating. The big advantage of this is that they're able to survive in conditions where prey items are not available as much, and it's probably one of the main reasons why the crocodile species has been able to outlive the dinosaurs. Really, they've been around since they were living at the time of the dinosaurs, and they're still living today. So when prey items do get scarce because of maybe climate change or just any change, they're able to kind of cope with it because they only really need to eat once every 3 years or once every year, depending on the species. Due to reptiles being ectotherms as well, ectotherms typically have lower metabolism rates, and they metabolize oxygen less, and this allows them to typically have a lot longer lifespans than mammals. For example, one of the oldest, or the oldest living creature that we know of is this species of Aldabra turtle, Aldabra giant tortoise, called Adawetia, which is this individual was found in India and is estimated to just be over 250 years old. And the only other species of animal that actually outlives these turtles or tortoises is a species of clam. So reptiles, generally on the whole, reptiles overall do have quite a high life expectancy, probably the highest life expectancy out of all the vertebrate groups, with the tortoises being the main ones that do live longest, but there has been some species of lizards to get over 100, and a lot of snakes such as Burmese pythons and ball pythons live 25, 30, 40, 50 years. There is, however, a downside of being cold-blooded, being ectothermic. One of the main reasons is that you are restricted to a limited environment based on your body temperature, so that limits things such as migration. They're not going to be able to travel or spread their population across large places if those places are surrounded by, say, cold areas, because they simply wouldn't be able to survive the journey in the cold parts. It just makes them very susceptible to climate change as well. So, for example, global warming is one of the main threats to reptiles. If reptiles that live in already hot, deserty climates and temperatures, if those type of areas get even hotter, they're going to have even hotter blood, hotter bodies, and they're going to have no way to be able to cool down, and it's going to essentially lead to them having a process called enzyme denaturization, in which their enzymes and the proteins in the enzymes lose their shape. They'll no longer be able to carry out their functions, and they will eventually die. Okay, so what species can be found in the UK? As shown here, the UK only has just a total of 12 native reptile species. We're not a very tropical climate. It's not a huge kind of amazing place for reptiles, but we still have a few native species. All of them can be found on this slide here. So starting from the top left here, we have the adder, then we have the smooth snake, then we have the common lizard, then we have the slow worm, sand lizard, and grass snake. That's it for our terrestrial reptiles. There are some other reptiles that would kind of be found in the UK, but are not considered as native species. They're species that have been brought over and are technically what would be classed as invasive species or non-native species. And an example of this would be the American bullfrog. And we have 6 species of sea turtle which can be found around the UK. This one here is the leatherback, then we have the loggerhead, the green sea turtle, the hawksbill sea turtle, the Kemp Ridley sea turtle, and the olive Ridley sea turtle. These are considered native UK species. However, some of these species will migrate away to warmer waters during the winter period, as obviously they are ectothermic, so they need to make sure that their body temperature is keeping up and high. Fortunately, most of our terrestrial species, at least, have pretty good population status. None of them are vulnerable on the IUCN Red List. However, some of them, such as the grass snake and the adder and the common lizard, their species are slightly on decline, and this is mostly due to just the general urbanization and development in the UK. It's also becoming more popular to have things such as designer gardens in which there's more patios and pavements and stones, as opposed to natural features such as maybe a small pond or longer grass and hedgerows, which is the kind of ideal environment for our UK reptiles. And the adder here on the left is the only species of snake in the UK which is venomous. However, its venom is very weak compared to some of the scary species that you might find over in Australia, for example. Unless you're very old or ill or very young, if you ever do come across this species and get bit or whatever, still should require medical attention, but it's typically not going to do any harm at all to you, really. Conservation. So the main threats we talked about a little bit, but yeah, the main threats are kind of similar to what the main threats to a lot of all the vertebrate species are, is habitat loss and degradation. This is especially prevalent in tropical areas, tropical rainforests, where there is a lot of biodiversity and there's a lot more species of reptiles, and the deforestation rate is a lot higher there and more severe. The main problem is that a lot of the reptile species are very specialist, have very specialist adaptations in which they can only really survive in very niche environments. So if there is any changes to their environments or their environments are lost, they can't just simply relocate or move slightly, because they're very dependent on the temperature in that environment, the humidity in that environment, even things such as like the amount of water. Some of them just have very specialist prey. They may only feed on one certain type of frog, for example. So if there's any habitat loss at all to them or their prey species, it becomes very detrimental to their population, and why a lot of the reptiles in those tropical areas are facing extinction and are on the vulnerable list. The next one to kind of touch upon is climate change. Climate change and drought, they're kind of similar, because obviously global warming is the main change that's happening to our climate, and obviously without the ability to regulate their own temperatures, if their environment does get too hot, there's nothing that they can really do about that to change. They can't migrate out of it. So that is one of their big threat. Another kind of new threat that reptiles are facing is chemical contamination. This is mostly for the aquatic reptiles such as the crocodiles. An example of this would be the gharial crocodile, which is found in Asia. Due to like urbanization in that part of the world, there's lots of factories, there's lots of sewage runoff without much safety measures, and this allows contaminants and chemicals being flushed into the rivers, getting into their habitats. And there's not actually much studies that have been on the effects of what happens to the long-term exposure to these chemical contaminants. It could cause things such as birth defects. It could make it so the females of the species are no longer fertile, so they can't have babies anymore. So it could end up being really detrimental to the survival of a lot of the aquatic species, and it's a very big threat that's fairly new. Next threat is invasive species. Invasive species can even be from their own group. So for example, here we have a Burmese python, and this is a very invasive species over in North America, in places like Florida. It was not a native species there, so it was brought over by the pet trade most likely, and it's even to the point where they have groups of people going out to hunt them and kill them or relocate them because they've just got such a high population over in that area, and they're stealing native reptiles' food, and even killing them, eating their native reptiles' eggs, for example. And they can have a really detrimental effect, and they can really mess up the ecosystem because they're not really meant to be there. The last threat is diseases. Rhinovirus here is a fairly new virus that's been discovered. Has a very high death rate if any reptile is infected, and the other one is a respiratory disease, or URTD, which is quite common in reptiles. Anyway, to get respiratory diseases, and it can lead to problems with the offspring as well, if the mother is pregnant whilst having the respiratory disease. So how can you help? To help UK reptiles, one of the main things that you can do is create a wildlife pond. The snake species in the UK, like the grass snake, smooth snake, actually feed off of amphibians and amphibian eggs, and ponds are a major attractive point for amphibians. So the more amphibians, the more prey, the more likely you get snakes, and the more food for the snakes, the more their population can increase. Another way is to create a log brush pile or shelter. This can allow them a place to hibernate during the colder periods, or just a place to hatch their eggs. Another thing is to keep your garden grass longer. This just gives the snakes more cover, or the lizards more cover, protects them from potential predators such as birds, or even your own house cat pets, or even dogs that may do damage to them. And another way is to not disturb compost heaps. You famously find slow worms in these, and you may also find grass snake eggs, as they act as like a natural incubator. And another way is to avoid any garden netting, or try to avoid even pavementing or patioing or your garden, and allow it to be as natural and as wild as possible to kind of give as much habitat, ideal habitat to UK's reptiles as much as possible, just so that none of their populations ever slip from declining into that kind of vulnerable status where we'll have to start putting in conservation measures and management plans to try and get their populations back up. And obviously another one of the main ways that you can really help is to go online, websites like WWF, for example, many research projects going to help the tropical kind of species, and studies to try and better understand, tropical reptiles' genetic makeups, to see how vulnerable they are to extinction, and to donate to those type of projects as well would really help, and to generally donate to projects that help reforest and stop deforestation, in general, just to get the habitat back up, because that is the main big threat to reptiles, is the habitat loss. So for reptiles, that's it. So thank you for listening in. I hope you now know just a little bit more about reptiles. And on the 12th of April, Nuki Zoo has announced that it will be reopening again. So you can come along and view some of their reptile species that they have in their tropical house exhibit. They have some species such as like the boa constrictor or racer snakes, a few chameleons, etc. And if you would like to donate and help Nuki Zoo, there will be a donation link in the description. this can help Nuki Zoo kind of recover from the lockdown period, because it's been tough for a lot of zoos across the country, especially for Nuki because it's a very small zoo, and it can also just help raise them more money just in case we do end up going into another lockdown. So if you have any questions, please be sure to comment below. Try and get to them, answer them as quickly as possible, and have a great rest of your day, and make sure to tune into the amphibian talk, which will be in a few hours from now. Cheers.